Welcome to Textured Realities, and our first speaker today is going to be David Lunn. David is the Simon Digby Postdoctoral Fellow at SOAS. After a BA in Oriental Studies from the University of Cambridge, he received his MA in Comparative Literature and Ph.D. in South Asian Studies from SOAS, and then he joined the European Research Council project Musical Transitions to European Colonialism in the Eastern Indian Ocean at King's College London, and he returned to SOAS in 2015. His research focuses on particularly on Hindi and Urdu literature, cinema, and the cultural and intellectual history of North India, with additional interests in music, Southeast Asia, Malay literature, and colonialism. And the title of his paper is I Thought It Was a Pity, and Other Queer Lines of the Satirical, Censored Anglo-Indo-Irish Aubrey Menon.
Well, thank you, Ross, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and yeah, I hope this will be of some interest to all of you. So I want to open, and this is all, I should also caveat, this is all brand new research, so it's all very exploratory and quite, tenuous. But anyway, with that, I want to open with a few of Aubrey Menon's own words. These are the opening lines to his 1965 novel, A Conspiracy of Woman. One day, when Alexander the Great was sitting in his tent, he said to his friend Hephaestion, "Hephaestion, have you ever thought about the fact that women make up half the human race?" "Once," said Hephaestion. "And what did you think about it?" said Alexander. "I thought it was a pity." These, then, are the first 7 lines of the novel, which Menon advises his readers are, in fact, all they really need to read if they want to understand, quote, why there is always war and trouble and quarrels in the world, but are pressed for time and don't want to read the whole novel. At least this is what he tells his male readers. He has, in fact, 2 separate prefaces, one for men and one for women. Now, the novel is hardly the first creative work to take the life and legend of Alexander of Macedon and give it a homoerotic twist. And here we have a sort of suitably naked Alexander lying in bed. However, Menon, in fact, goes much further than this, constructing a careful and indeed bitingly funny and at times quite profound satire out of Alexander's and the Macedonians' encounters with Persia and India, sending up imperialism, colonialism, nationalism, gender norms, and heteronormativity more broadly in the process, with dry wit and in eminently readable prose. Now, what I want to do today is to take you through some of Aubrey Menon's queer lines, both in A Conspiracy of Woman and in one of his autobiographies, A Space Within the Heart, which he published in 1970. Given the themes of this year's conference, desire, decriminalisation and decolonisation, Aubrey Menon just struck me as someone who was a superbly appropriate subject. His writings, his satire, and his identity, both as perceived by others and presented by himself as a mixed race, mood lighting, a mixed-raced queer author, speaks powerfully to each of these themes, not least because of the period in which he was working, either side of the decriminalisation of homosexual acts in the UK in 1967. But let's start with some background. Who was Aubrey Menon? This is unfortunately quite a pertinent question, since despite his significant success and popularity in his own lifetime, he's largely faded from view, finding at most a sort of short mention in occasional studies and literary histories, most of these treating only his most obvious colonial satire and his first novel, called The Prevalence of Witches. His obscurity and his erasure is well demonstrated by the title of a paper by Mary Jane Hurst in 1994, which she called Reintroducing Aubrey Menon, wherein she attempted to, quote, reclaim his relevance for literary and cultural studies. And this is a project that I'd hope to advance a little today. Now, Aubrey Menon was born in London in 1912. He's written quite frankly of his mixed-race background, as well as of his quite troubled relationships with his Indian Nair Caroline father and his formidable Irish mother, something I know well. Menon's life oscillated between England, India and Italy, and by the time he passed away in Kerala in 1989 he had published some 10 novels, 3 autobiographical works and at least 8 book-length non-fiction works, as well as a host of shorter pieces of writing and several unpublished and unfinished manuscripts. Now here we see Aubrey Menon in 1966 in this little quote that it appeared in an American newspaper, I can't remember which one, but it said, "The Irish-Indian author Aubrey Menon, author of the novel The Duke of Caladoro, is living in Eremita in Amalfi. The novel is an enormous success in England and the United States." Now, needless to say, I'm not going to be addressing all of Aubrey Menon's novels or indeed writings today. I'm torn between not wanting to regurgitate the most obvious elements of his life story, those bits that have received at least some scant academic attention, and needing to lay out the basic contours of his life and trajectory. Perhaps the best way through this is to start with his autobiography and pull out what struck me as some of the most significant moments from that. There are sort of three, and this is, yes, a space within the heart. So there's three sort of rough areas: race, solitude, and sexuality, that I want to kind of explore through Menon's autobiography, and particularly how he figures race with his identity politics, how solitude features as a kind of queering imperative for him, and his sexuality, not that that is in any way delinked from the other two. Now I want to begin, as all stories do, with his mother. He describes her meeting his father thus, I quote, "But it had all begun so wonderfully well," that is, his life. He had come to England to study to be a doctor. She had taken up nursing as an excuse to come to London from the country. They had fallen in love. They decided to marry. The year was 1910. The supremacy of the white races over the coloured ones had never been so firmly established. My mother's announcement to her family that she meant to marry a black man quite spoiled the Delhi Darbar for them. This telescoping, then, between the particular spectacle of his parents' decision to the grand spectacle against the geopolitical backdrop of the Delhi Darbar of George V is both subtle and significant, I think. But while Menon doesn't push the imperialism aspect particularly hard in his autobiography, he does return in a sort of Freudian mode to his mother's affection, or indeed fetish, for brown skin, though empire is always appropriately lurking in the background. He recounts one encounter. "Do you know," she asks him, "why I married your father?" "When I was a little girl," she said, "we used to dress dolls to give to the missionaries. I always chose a brown doll. I mean, one with a brown face. Most of them were white, pink and white, but for me, no, I had to have a brown one." Menon attests that his mother's attraction to young brown men persisted, leading to her to having at least one affair with a younger Indian man, and also to her attempts to seduce her own son when he was in his mid to late teens. It has a direct impact on his attempts to reconcile his mixed-race heritage with his sexuality and other subject positions. When he recounts the performance of his first play, entitled Genesis 2, and which was tried for obscenity, he recounts, quote, "When I came to examine this part of my life, I found it at first quite satisfactory. I could stand between two cultures. I had pointed out the faults of one of them. Surely I could claim this to be at least part of my true self. I went to bed happy. I woke at 5, fully awake and furious, just plainly furious. Myself, my genesis, was the product of a little country girl playing with a brown doll. The fertilizing of that egg had been an obscene affair." And though I don't really have time to go into it, let's just say that this is not the only time that Menon turns the tables on and indeed queers the institution of kind of procreative heterosexuality. Now, I'd said that I was going to talk about his desire for solitude, but I think I'm going to skip that part and move on to sort of a direct engagement with his engagements with his own sexuality. Now, it comes up again and again in his writings. Menon was for a time on the fringes of the Bloomsbury set, so it seems appropriate to be talking about him here in the heart of Bloomsbury. Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, and all these others, featuring as peripheral characters, particularly in that part of his life, in his late teens and early 20s when he lived on Charlotte Street, just a couple of blocks west of where we are now. As he recounts, these young bohemians fancied themselves quite permissive progressives. And I quote, "We did not believe that sex was beautiful, but we were sure it should be uninhibited by mosaic laws of the permitted and the forbidden. Freedom was all. Although we talked incessantly about sex, we did not have a lot of it." A young woman who professed very advanced views about homosexuality once complained that she did not actually know what went on between two men. Full of my newfound freedom, I offered to let her watch. My current friend and I made love on a camp bed by a gas fire while she watched, glancing up occasionally from the pages of a book in a very ladylike way. A week later, she stole my boyfriend, and they had a very satisfactory affair together. So constant for Menon was the spectre of his race and the fetish that made him. As he told his publishers with reference to publicity for a forthcoming book, quote, "Journalists will be disappointed if you don't assure them that I write my book sitting on a bed of nails." This orientalizing, stereotyping attitude pursued him into bed. he writes of his first heterosexual, in fact, experience, which came about in Paris when his mother packed him off to the opera one evening so she could conduct her own sexual liaison uninhibited. Juliette, a young French woman of impressive bearing and apparently voracious sexual appetite, certainly satisfied and entertained him for a while. But, and I quote, "I had dodged all her questions about my parents, but one afternoon she told me how fascinated she was by the colour of my skin. Since she had seen more of my skin than anybody else I knew, I told her how I had come about it. It was a disaster. From that day on, she insisted that I had mystic depths. Thank you. Mystic depths got mixed up later with hidden sources of sexual powers. She was sure I worshipped Shiva." So Menen writes with humour and flair of both the relationship and the sex, though it's perhaps a little early in the morning to go into some of the more graphic passages. The encounter with Juliette is followed immediately after in the narrative, though I don't think immediately after in his life's chronology, with an encounter with Claude, a male French prostitute, and again in Paris. This encounter was paid for, which clearly made Menen uncomfortable, but it was precisely in this situation that he finally found a release from the orientalising expectations that pursued him elsewhere. And again I quote, "I did not love him. I had no need to love him. Our bodies took each other, and the morning stars sang together. It is that secret which, when we grow old, we begrudge the young. Claude and I slept in each other's arms until morning. Claude smiled a lot, mentioned the weather once or twice, took his money, and we made for the bar. He asked me no questions. He did not think I was a mystic." And Claude is this figure that returns later in Menen's sort of elliptical narrative when he talks through issues of sin and faith and redemption and conversion with an Irish Catholic cardinal and tells him of his past homosexual affairs. And again I quote, "I decided to solve all my personal problems at one blow and to become a Catholic." Which, yeah. So we sat one evening on the altar steps of the empty Sistine Chapel. I talked about my life, I talked about Claude and all the other Claudes I had known. Monsignor O'Flaherty waved a hand at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which, as all the world knows, is decorated with nude pictures of Roman street boys, beloved by Michelangelo. "That's no problem at all," said O'Flaherty, "or they wouldn't be there." Now, I then want to turn quickly in the sort of last 5 minutes, or 3 minutes, to the other half of my paper, which is, I want to look at his one of his novels, and this is, as I mentioned, which I opened the paper with, A Conspiracy of Woman. This is then this wonderful satire on so many things, really. Two of the figures that are quite central are Berenice, a Persian woman who marries a Macedonian attendant in Alexander the Great's army, a man called Baffle Us, and then influences Alexander in a plan to bring about peace to the world. And that peace is, she avows, going to be obtained through love. And so Alexander the Great orders all his soldiers to follow the example of Baffle Us and marry foreign women. And then we'll have world peace. Needless to say, hilarity ensues. Now, it's a satire on marriage, it's a satire on imperialism, an analogy, particularly in its latter stages, for the colonial encounter between Britain and India, as Alexander marches to the river Indus in Taxila, and encounters a kingdom ruled by scheming Brahmins, and this is a kind of theme he returns to in another satire of his called Rama Retold. It's a retelling of the Ramayana that was banned in India immediately. It's all, Rama, the god king, is kind of duped by Brahmins. It remains banned in India, but we don't. I think there was a paper yesterday that touched on some of these parts. Anyway, so it's a Baffle Us was this character central to the novel. It's also central to Roman poet Juvenal's sixth satire against women, a satire with what we might call queer moments, as when the poet asks someone who's getting married, "Posthumus, are you getting married? Tell me about what fury and what vipers you are goaded. Can you endure any masteress when there are so many good strong ropes, with high vertiginous windows are wide open, when the Emilian Bridge offers itself to you just right next door?" So in other words, why not kill yourself? "Or if from so many options no mode of death strikes your fancy, surely you think it better that a supple boy sleep with you, a boy who does not conduct a nocturnal lawsuit at you, who wheedles no little gifts from you as he lies there, and neither complains because you are going too easy on him, nor because you don't gasp as much as he demands." So we can see then the obvious kind of roots of Menen's satire. What page am I on? Yes. In this Roman thing, and this is Baffle Us and the kind of well, enjoy those pictures. We're told by Juvenal he provoked Roman matrons to a state of sexual frenzy, and we can see here a couple of illustrations by another Aubrey, that is Aubrey Beardsley, an associate of Oscar Wilde and others in the sort of end of the 19th century. So when Alexander's plan then in Menon's novel to have his soldiers marry foreign women, it goes horribly wrong, and the Macedonian sort of sweethearts of these soldiers gather together. And maybe I have time to read a very short extract, I don't really, but when the women gather together, what of our poor Macedonian boys? What is going to be their reward for going out there and fighting in the front line to save our country from the invader? What is their reward for being ready to lay down their lives for Macedon, to come back to bed with a foreign woman and make love in foreign ways? I have nothing against Alexander, he's got a lot in his mind, but who put this idea, this horrible idea, into his head, girls? Who else but a foreign woman? So, I feel like I shouldn't spoil the ending, and I should really get to my ending. So, let's see. Menen, oh, and there's some other drawings of, oh yeah, that's more Beardsley. Too early in the morning for all that. But, again, Alexander's sort of homoeroticism, homosexuality is also satirized, the institution of marriage being satirized by Alexander's own marriage to 3 women. None of these marriages is consummated by Alexander, or indeed most of the soldiers in his army. And the only sort of uncertainty is whether Alexander had a more passionate relationship with Hephaestion, his friend in general, in his army, or with his horse. So Menon's this careful satire on prejudice and ignorance reminds us of the work that remained and remains to do in terms of decolonization, not just leaving India, but decolonizing the mind, and all this orientalizing that I've been trying to bring up really, I think, speaks to that. Now, Menon remains understudied, and I think there's many possible reasons for this. I don't think it's because of his queerness or any latent kind of homophobia against his works. His stories were well received in his lifetime, and the reviews don't seem to have made anything of his sexuality or his take on sexuality in his books. His Anglo-Indianness may have fallen between the cracks, as it were, and has perhaps been, has been obliquely suggested by Ravani Ranasinghe, his very refusal to quote stage Indianness in the manner of his forerunners, or to write about diasporic identity in quite the way that was to become so enthusiastically taken up by postcolonial studies and the authors that it treats with, means he occupies a kind of liminal space between these two historical and academic foci. And I'm not, there's a hysterical bit from the Daily Mail, but we're going to skip that too. So if we think, what can we call him? I called him in the title of this paper, this Anglo-Indo-Irish. What would he have thought about that label? Well, he had his own perspective on this. A reviewer of his first novel suggested that, quote, among Menon's strong qualities is an insight into the primitive mind. Menon, who worked in India for several years but was born and educated in England, wryly distanced himself from such a construction in private correspondence with his publishers. He said, on the whole, I prefer not to be called Indian. I am not Indian. I don't speak a word of any Indian language except Acha. I am not Hindu or Muslim, and I don't kill people who are. I am by birth, language, and inclinations English. In fact, so English that I do not like embarrassing other Englishmen by saying so. And so I think I really do need to stop. Let's just say that in his, again, back to the autobiography, would he have accepted this label of queer? I think so. Perhaps even enthusiastically. Towards the end of his autobiography, in a section entitled A Short History of Sin, he took issue with what he called the neo-Freudians, those who had announced that Freud's view of the world, or view of the condition of man, was altogether too gloomy, and those unfortunates who were not quite ship-shape, no doubt because of some unhappy childhood or some other unpleasant experience, could be put right. He termed these the straighteners, and he went on, sin, says my notebook, is not sex anymore. That has been coped with by the straighteners. To be sinful is not to conform. There's always a possibility now that I'm overreading this, but I'm pretty sold on the fact that if we needed any further proof of the queering potential and the queering achievements of Menon's satire, this is it. A little later in the same book, in a similarly philosophical mode, he bemoans the prominence given to the Buddha over other renunciatory and Shramana or non-Brahmin innovators of the same period, who, according to him, advocated nothing less than total rebellion. Transgression, non-conformity, refusal to comply with the normative demands of society, surely, by any other name, queer. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Our next speaker is Kyunghee Sabina, and she is a Ph.D. candidate in English and Gender Studies at the University of Southern California. Her interests lie at the intersection of gender, sexuality, postcoloniality, and sub-imperialism across the trans-Pacific world. Her Ph.D. thesis, Politics of Purity, Violence, Memory, and the Queerness of Girlhood in the Trans-Pacific, focuses on literary and visual representation of girlhood in Korean, Japanese, and U.S. cultural production. She is also a translator of Korean writings, with some of her work soon appearing in Ready-Made Bodhisattva and other science fiction stories from South Korea, which is coming out with Kaya Press in 2018, and in other venues.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. So there has been a slight change in the title of my presentation from the program that we have, so I just wanted to let you know. Now I'm going to dive right in for the sake of time. So I'd like to begin my presentation by talking a little bit about the death of two girls in 1931 colonial Korea. The Yeongdeung portraying suicide refers to the double suicide of two girl students you see on the screen, Kim Yong-ju and Hong Oh-kim, who threw themselves in front of an approaching train with their bodies locked in embrace. And these are some examples of news articles that covered their death, and you see their photos in many of them. So the media frenzy surrounding this incident shows how deeply alarmed and fascinated the public was by the idea of a passionate love affair between two well-to-do girls, especially as it led to the tragedy of their self-destruction. Indeed, the reading public of colonial Korea was eager to understand the phenomena of schoolgirl love. Western medical discourses on homosexuality were introduced through Japanese translations, and many newspapers, magazines, and literary writings described in melodramatic detail the love letters, tokens of affection, and the enclosed space of school dormitories that girl students shared in the practicing of their love. Intellectuals pondered over the social ramifications of same-sex love between girls, though often concluding uncertainly that it was a transitory phase that would most likely pass with the coming of adulthood. In a way, it is through the phenomena of schoolgirl love in the colonial period that Korean society first came to grapple with the modern concept of homosexuality. And this, you see, is a photo of another famous girl student couple, Lee Do-gyu and Lee Hyung-kyung on the left side. And on the right side, you see a magazine illustration of what people imagined girls in same-sex relationships or sister relationships, as they refer to themselves, would actually look like. So it is important to situate girl love in colonial Korea within a wider spread culture of girl homosociality and homoeroticism that existed in other parts of East Asia in the early 20th century. So these are some book-length studies that have been published in the recent years that put a strong focus on schoolgirl romances in the early 20th century. So the book on the far right side is by Fran Martin, and in this book, Backward Glances, she insightfully points out that the shoujo cultures, or girl cultures, of pre-war Japan had an immediate and long-lasting impact on the emergence of schoolgirl love, not only in China, but in other East Asian regions that were also under Imperial Japan's reach. So it was pretty much the institution of girl education for girls first. I guess it was in the Meiji period, late 19th century, where they made these institutions in Japan and were exported to their other colonies in East Asia, and pretty much the customs of girl love or representations of girl love were sort of traveling around the region along with Imperial Japan's sort of governance. So for this reason, I believe that my research on girl love in colonial Korea can and should build on this body of work by other East Asian scholars, and hopefully I could further some of the theoretical debates that they have initiated in their work. A recurring question that I notice within East Asian studies scholarship is whether to use West-originating theoretical concepts such as lesbian or queer within their analysis of early 20th century girl love. Fran Martin, for example, prefers to use the term homoeroticism as opposed to lesbian in her study, for fear of the latter term invoking a minoritized political position rather than love between women in general. Deborah Shamoon also argues that insofar as the term queer in the Western context refers to a distinct politics of anti-normativity, it does not have much to do with the phenomena of schoolgirl love in pre-war Japan, which was accepted as sexually normative behavior for girls. These choices reflect an acknowledgement of certain unique characteristics of schoolgirl love as it took place in the early 20th century in East Asia. First, it was part of a normative mainstream girl culture rather than a minoritarian subculture. And second, more value was placed on the spiritual aspect rather than the corporeal and physical aspect of the relationship. And third, the girls celebrated the innocent and chaste nature of their love for one another. So in a way, you can say that women and girls of the early 20th century who practiced this type of love or who consumed cultural contents that represented this type of love were sort of reproducing or consolidating the myth of virginity, and this fact might perhaps be rather deflating to the contemporary queer feminist scholar. What may be even more baffling for scholars outside of Asia is the extent to which the idea of girlhood innocence is still being celebrated in contemporary literary and popular cultures for and by women in the region. So this is a still shot from the popular light novel turned anime series Maria Sama ga Mitteru, or Maria is Watching Over Us, which pretty much plays off of all the plot lines and aesthetic cliches of girl love as it sort of emerged in the early 20th century in Japan. This gathered enormous fandom not only in Japan but also in Korea, and I'm assuming in the Sinophone cultures as well. So here I reiterate the vexed question that Saba Mahmood raised in her study of Muslim women's religious turn towards piety. Why would such a large number of women actively support an ideal that seems inimical to their own interests and agendas? My argument is that the idealization of girl innocence in Korean women's writings on same-sex love embodies what I call queer virginity as a valid mode of resistance to the gendered violence that took place under the Japanese colonial regime and the ensuing Korean War. The emphasis on sexual and spiritual purity in such writings is not to be dismissed as a form of denial or sanitization of female same-sex desire, but should be recognized as the very essence of what women readers or girl readers are looking for when they look at representations of schoolgirl love. In this presentation, I examine the life and writings of Kim Myung-sun, who is a woman writer of the colonial period whose work has been curiously undermentioned by feminist literary scholars in Korea over the years. I foreground girl intimacies that appear in her writing not simply for the sake of discovering a proto-lesbian literary tradition in Korean women's writing, but more to rethink how sexual normativity has operated in Korean cultural life over the past century and how it intersects with modernity, coloniality, and the nation state. So before I go into my discussion of Kim Myung-sun, I need to talk a little bit about the New Woman, a term that refers to a small group of elite women who became prominent public figures in art, literature, education, journalism, and politics in the 1920s. According to Haewol-che, anxiety towards women's emergence in the public sphere led to certain stereotypes of the new women to be created. So people thought the new woman was someone who rejected the sacred nature of motherhood, engaged in scandalous love affairs, and indulged in the worldly pleasures of shopping. End quote. The painter-writer Da Hye-seok, you see on the slide, is undoubtedly the most well-known representative of this new woman figure and is firmly established within the Korean women's literary canon as the first and most influential modern woman writer in Korea. Now, I am interested in figuring out why Kim Myung-sun, who I am trying to examine in my work, why her life and writings have never received as much attention as Da Hye-seok, who you see on the screen, despite the many striking similarities that the two writers share. So they were both born in 1896, so they were the exact same age. They went to Japan on the same year in 1913 when they were around 17 years old. And just for the fact that they were in Japan at such a young age as unmarried schoolgirls, they attracted so much media attraction. They were already something of a celebrity. So there's no doubt that they knew each other, but I couldn't find as of yet any proof that they acknowledged each other or were in contact with each other, even though Da Hye-seok was good friends with many of the women that you see on the screen. So you can say that Kim Myung-sun was something of a loner within this peer group of elite women, and I'm trying to figure out why that is. Going back, both women were prolific and versatile writers, leaving behind an impressive literary oeuvre that consists not only of fiction but also of poetry, nonfiction, plays, and etc. There exist, however, certain biographical aspects about Kim that separate her from not only Na, but also other new women writers and intellectuals of her generation in general. First, most young women and men who attended modern educational institutions and most likely went on to study abroad in Japan during this period were from families of higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And Na, for instance, was the daughter of Da Ki-jong, a wealthy government official in Seoul. Kim Myung-soon's father was also of the elite class, but her birth mother was a concubine. And even though the traditional caste system in Korea had already been abolished in the 1894 reform, children born from secondary spouses were still considered to be of an inferior caste within the early 20th century social order. As a female public figure, Kim Myung-soon had to endure a lifetime of social derision and severe ostracization from her elite peers. This is a subject that she often writes about in her fiction and autobiographical essays. Second, the free love discourse that was circulating in early 20th century Asia was an integral part of young women and men's self-identification as modern subjects. They preferred to engage in romantic courtship and marriage with a partner chosen of one's own will, as opposed to submitting to early marriages arranged between the families. The concept of free love held a particularly poignant meaning for women who were still heavily pressured by the social imperative of premarital chastity. New women writers such as Na Hae-seok, Kim Won-ju, and Ho Jong-suk, who you all see on the screen, were all deeply influenced by the Japanese blue stockings and their writings on free love while they were studying in Tokyo. And many of them argued that, quote, our liberation begins with our liberation from chastity, end quote. They not only wrote extensively on the subject, but also scandalized the public with their own extramarital love affairs, divorces, and remarriages. Contrary to her peers, Kim Myung-soon's writings on the question of female sexual freedom are shockingly sparse. Not only that, but Kim stands out as the only one among the new women who never once married during her lifetime, and she further goes on to argue that she had never loved a man in her life. This aspect of her life is worthy of notice, since during that period, for women to not ever marry was considered even more of an anomaly, a social anomaly, than to become a divorcee after a marriage, a failed marriage. A closer look at Kim Myung-soon's life trajectory provides some insight as to why she lived such a life of celibacy. As a young schoolgirl in Japan, Kim was date raped by Lee Eun-jun, who was a Korean student in the Japanese military academy. The news of the rape was widely circulated by writers and journalists in both countries, and Kim ended up being expelled from the girls' school she was attending in Tokyo for disgraceful conduct. Yi walked away from the incident unscathed. After returning to Korea, Kim had to suffer through a tremendous amount of victim blaming and public shaming, and her several failed suicide attempts attest not only to the trauma of sexual violence itself, but also the social estrangement she had to endure in its aftermath. This means that, unlike Na Hae-seok and the majority of new women who experimented with the doctrines of free love, after safely crossing the threshold of marriage, rampant rumors of her premarital defilement had placed Kim outside of the normative institutions of modern courtship and marriage altogether. 2 years after the rape, Kim Myung-soon publishes her first short story, A Girl of Mystery, or 의심의 소녀, in the November 1917 issue of a literary magazine, 청춘. The narrative is centered on Pomne, the mysterious 9-year-old girl child and girl protagonist who moved to the small village of Semaul with an old, white-haired man. The village girls are dazzled by Pomne's lovely face and appearance. Pomne's physical beauty, which serves as a narrative device to heighten her aura of mystery, is revealed through the lustful gaze of the local girls. Quote, one girl said, "She is so lovely, I wonder where she lived before," and another says, "I can't get enough of her no matter how many times I look at her. She is always pretty. I wish I saw her as much as I'd like to." End quote. Meanwhile, the adult townspeople are busy gossiping about the girl's family background. They are curious to know where she comes from and who the old man is, but the family receives no visitors and did not associate with the other villagers. The only character in the story who succeeds in verbally interacting with Pomne is Tukshil, a younger village girl who is obviously taken by Pomne's pure and pristine beauty. What is interesting about the two girls' dialogue is not the spoken content itself, but rather the many smiles, whispers, blushes, and silences that accentuate their short conversation. The bodily signs of pleasure that they display point to an exchange of affection and empathy that far exceeds their verbal and physical interaction. The two girls' friendship, however, ends prematurely as Pomne is forced to leave the village when scandalous rumors surrounding her family reach the locals' ears. It turns out the girl had fled her home with her maternal grandfather when her father leaves her mother for a concubine, and her mother, over this incident, her mother commits suicide. The lack of critical attention paid to this text by Korean feminist literary scholars is rather surprising, especially considering its landmark status as the first known piece of modern fiction published by a female writer in Korea. I suggest that this is primarily because Pomne does not seem to offer a particularly compelling form of modern feminist subjectivity, especially when compared to Dae Hae-seok's short story Kyunghee, which was published 4 months after A Girl of Mystery. The liberal feminist message in that story is given in a much more straightforward manner. The intelligent girl student Kyunghee rejects her father's wishes for her to marry and instead decides to continue her studies in Japan. Vowing to protect her, quote, God-given rights and freedom as a member of the universal human race, end quote, Kyunghee makes for a convenient symbol of new womanhood in colonial Korea, and in the recent decades, the story has thus become the favorite topic for research among women scholars in Korea. Pomne, on the other hand, is an idealization of the sexual and spiritual purity of the virginal Korean girl, a figure that appears to many as a sign of the sexual oppression of women. For this reason, feminist scholars who do engage with A Girl of Mystery tend to divert their attention away from Pomne and instead focus on the mother character, thereby reading the story as Kim's indirect critique of the institution of concubinage. This type of feminist reading comes with a cost. The queer friendship between Pomne and Tukshir is downplayed, and the sensuousness of the girl gaze dismissed as a mere plot device. A Girl of Mystery is no doubt a story that idealizes girl innocence, but the bubble of intimacy that the girl characters create around themselves functions as a protective layer against the masculinist logic that dominates the adult world. To remain in this bubble of sexual immaturity is perhaps an enactment of certain politics, a politics of purity, that confounds by turning the norm around on itself. As Saba Mahmood reminds us, the study of women demands from us an ability to imagine female agency, not only as the capacity for progressive change, but also, more importantly, as the capacity to endure, suffer, and persist. Sorry for going over time. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Alberto Poyatos, who was born in Spain 27 years ago, he tells us, and is currently finishing an MA in Gender Studies at the Central European University in Budapest. He's lived in London, Taipei, and Budapest, and is trying to understand more about literature, fantasy, and sexuality, and the ways in which the three of them allow us to imagine the future.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be in this panel because I think what I'm proposing can be applicable to what we have been listening already. I think that every time we take literature and we retroactively go and find sexualities or behaviors that we name in a certain way in past literatures, we're kind of constraining the characters or the people that we are talking about. We might be missing some of their affective lives by the very fact of putting labels on them. And this is why my presentation today is, well, it's part of a larger project. And in this project, I want to explore, it's more like an experiment, what I've called an affective reading. And the idea of this affective reading is to challenge the Western discourse of sexual identity and provide with a more fluid way of giving account of affective events in literature. I will first give you a little bit of the context of the story that I'm using, of the Taiwanese queer literature of the 80s and the 90s, and of the queer discourse that informs my research. Then I will move on to illustrate my argument with a case study in 3 steps. First, I will try to show you how the affective acquires significance in the story I'm using. Secondly, I will show how the first affective event creates a script for the character that plays a role in the way the character unfolds and makes sense of herself. And lastly, I will point out how the English translation works in the direction of narrowing down the subjective and infinite potential of the affective life of the protagonist into something that can make her intelligible under the framework of identity politics. So, the story that I'm using is Curvaceous Dolls by Liang. It was written in 1987, and it's a story of a married woman who starts feeling dissatisfied with her life. In the development of the text, she becomes obsessed with three main objects that provide her satisfaction and security. These objects are dolls, breasts, and a monster at the end of the story. And although this story is often used to create a narrative of gradual development towards what has been called a full disclosure of lesbianism in Liang's work in general, it seems to me that this reading responds more to a need to unveil and name the female character's desire from an identity-based perspective held by the translators and the readers than to Liang's positioning, because although she has been interviewed several times, she has never said that she writes about lesbianism. She always says something like she likes to write about women's eroticism. I will argue that the catalogization of the character's development as a case of repressed lesbian desire, as some literary critics and translators have done, instead of being a progressive move from the side of the English readership, reinforces a discourse on sexuality as integral to the individual's identity that was already being contested in Taiwan in the 90s. Despite this queer, and when I say queer in Taiwan I mean queer, a discourse that started in the 90s, the English renditions and reviews of this Taiwanese short story, like the one I'm using by Howard Goldblatt that was translated in 1997, it's easy to encounter a recurrent wish on the side of the editor, the translator, and perhaps in the side of the reader too, to find in Liang's text the tale of a repressed lesbian desire. I want to suggest that, funnily enough, the English-speaking readership is being prey to the same restrictive symbolic world that constrains the development of the female character in the story. And contrarily, I want to propose an alternative reading of the character, and for this reading in my larger paper I resort to affect theory, object relations theory, and French feminist theory, because I believe they provide with the vocabulary that I need to do it. And the idea is to stay away from an understanding of identities as the materialization of patterns of desire and focus instead in the characters' wishing experiences, their iterable affective components, and their role in the character's development, which I believe is actually a more effective way to visibilize the protagonist and account for her agency, rather than just giving her the label of lesbian and then saying she is repressed. This project is particularly important in the Taiwanese literary context of the 80s and the 90s because of the social consequences that the use of specific interpretations of this literary past have in social discourse. Queer characters and situations written back then are being interpreted as either an example of the ways in which Western progressiveness degenerates Taiwanese traditional values, or through a lens that tries to normalize and incorporate normative desires into taxonomies of identity politics. And for the sake of clarification, I will provide a couple of examples of this phenomenon that I'm referring to. The first one would be the interpretation of Crystal Boy's Niet, written in 1983, that appears in its author's biography by Wang Jiming. In this biographical account of the writer and LGBT advocate Pai Xianyong, the author completely disregards the role of homosexual desire, prostitution, and the cruising scene in the novel to favor an explanation of the character's abnormal behavior that resorts to the trauma for lacking a father figure. The other example I want to show is Huang Yuxiu magazine article in 1993 about the internationally acclaimed film Wedding Banquet. This text shows how the author is concerned on Wedding Banquet being read as the story of a gay man that navigates his sexuality to finally abide by his filial duties towards his family and get married. So, and I believe that under this interpretation, what we are seeing is the story of a homosexual desire that is actually a burden, and the main plot of the story is how do we navigate this to finally perform the filial piety that we need to perform. As I'm suggesting, literature could be a visibilizing tool for normative desires, but it can also be turned into yet another normalizing device if alternative readings to the normativization of queer characters and situations are not provided. Therefore, I believe it would not be fair to, from the West, retroactively impose upon any seemingly queer or dysfunctional character we may find in Taiwanese literature yet another category embedded in the rhetoric of progress, just to avoid facing the challenge of analyzing them from a different perspective. And if the effort has been made to read the gang of homosexual prostitutes of Crystal Boys as children yearning for their missing father, and Liang's character has been rendered as a repressed lesbian without needing her to ever express her sexual interest in women, it should not sound too queer to propose reading them from an affective perspective and with the upfront political purpose of challenging the assumed progressiveness that accompanies identity politics truth claims. I believe that failing to provide an alternative form of reading Liang's Curvaceous Dolls would mean that her female protagonist will remain a lesbian, an objective subject that serves the purpose of sustaining an almost inviolable mechanism of meaning production that in the context of Taiwanese literature is ultimately complicit with a homophobic reticent poetics that turn coming out into putting out of visibility. And this is a discourse that can easily be coopted to exemplify the decadence of progress and modernity that the West has brought. And well, this is pretty much the kind of affective reading that I want to propose to you all today. And I will illustrate this focusing in the first object of desire that appears in the story, which is the dolls. Okay, in the first slide, I will first give you a little bit of context. This happens in a scene wherein the female character is crying and tries to approach her husband. He assumes she is feeling sad because of a recurrent memory she has of when she was little. And when she was little, she liked to play with dolls. One night, after having had sex, she confesses to her husband how, when she was a kid, she had made a rag doll out of a bundle of old clothes, and her friends had ridiculed her. To her embarrassment, his response is a display of disgust for her affective attachment to the doll. And this is where I find the husband naming her affective life and compressing it in the figure of the doll to make her feelings, which he doesn't let her express, understandable for him. For those of you familiar with Julia Kristeva's theory, I would say this is the moment in which the rupture that inaugurates the subject happens. Her semiotic meaning, the semiotic meaning of the female character, enters the symbolic projected by her husband's disgust. And disgust is a very interesting affect that, according to the psychologist Sylvan Tompkins, serves the purpose of breaking the connection between the object of desire and its desiring subject. I can see here how clearly the husband is forcing this rupture on her, in the quotation. However, Tompkins also argues that shame is an affect that, while it pushes the subject away from that which is ashaming, also preserves the shaming object within the self, in case it could be a source of joy in the future. And he illustrates this with an example, which is a little kid that is ashamed for whatever she is ashamed, and he covers his face with his hands. By covering the face, he's breaking communication between him and the object of shame, but at the same time, usually little kids, when they are ashamed, they leave space between their fingers, because Tompkins says shame also preserves the idea that the object that provokes shame might be an object that brings pleasure or joy in the future. And although you want to block that communication, you kind of want to keep it just in case. It's a very paradoxical move. And I argue that this is what the protagonist is doing. She's hiding her affective life that has just been assigned by her husband, and by preserving it, she's kind of keeping it for herself and for the future as a source of future joy. I understand that she's not concerned about the abjection or shaming of the doll as an object, but concerned about her husband shaming the affective meaning that for her has the attachment with the doll. My argument is that the English translation and its Western interpretation fails to convey the richness of the female protagonist's affective life, because I think they're too entertained pushing the character to come out as a lesbian. In the second slide, this scene belongs to the second time she feels depressed and in need to talk with her husband about her feelings. She remembers what happened the first time, when all the emotions that she wanted to share were ashamed under the figure of the doll, and she literally names this second need of conversation by randomly recollecting some childhood memories of when she used to play with clay. This is where I find the script that I was mentioning before being enacted. In a way that is not fully conscious, she equates her feeling low or depressed with the previous time she had tried to share these feelings with her husband, and uses the clay doll as the object of her emotional state. I think that she has basically learned shame, and this is something that Tompkins also talks about. He explains that past shaming experiences affect the way the subject understands future events, and the way in which the subject makes sense of future events happening to her. Then how does the English translation deal with these kind of unspoken or unnameable affect that I'm trying to find? Well, I propose that it does so very much in line with the husband's constraining behavior, and we can find in this slide, which belongs not to the scene in which, conditioned by previous shaming experience, she names her affective life after the doll, but to the moment when she is actually recollecting the memories of her childhood when she used to play with clay to make figurines. This is one of the samples, one of the most pointing samples, I think, in which I see the translation insufficient and too concerned with making the character understandable within an identity-based model, trying to understand and control her the same way the husband does it. I don't know if someone can already find the problem I want to point at. It's in the word niren, which I translate as clay figurine, but in the English translation has purposefully been translated as clay doll. Translating it as clay doll when the female protagonist recalls the memories, it's I believe the translator, is kind of pushing the reader to make a gender assumption and paving the way to what will become the interpretation of this story as that of repressed lesbian desire. So in the previous slide, we see how the character names her affective life the same way she has learned to do it, and she herself says clay doll. But when she thinks about when she was little and she used to make these clay dolls, in Chinese she doesn't say the word for doll, she says niren instead, but in the English translation it has been all homogenized. And I don't know why the translator would do that, but I think it serves the purpose of you're definitely missing something. She's not saying the same thing when she remembers and when she's naming her affective life, using the exact same words her husband used to shame her. And this would serve as a good summary of my argument, which is that an affective reading can help to challenge the Western discourse on sexual identities by paying attention to the affective life of the characters without naming them, and by letting their experiences speak, no matter how unintelligible they are for our standards. This way, I think we open a space to think of the implications of reading characters and perhaps people too, under the rules of identity politics, truth claims. These rules, I think, in the context of Taiwan, are serving the purpose of putting out of visibility ways of understanding sexuality that cannot be thought of within a fixed structure of identities. Or even worse, I think that they might be using to highlight the degrading effects of Western modernity in Taiwan's traditional culture. Thank you.
Our final speaker today is Shamini Kothari. She is currently pursuing a master's in sexual dissidence at the University of Sussex, and we had some discussion about the title of that master's. Research interests include feminist and queer theory, post-colonial and decolonial theory, literature and visual culture, and the intersections between these, especially in South Asia.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, but I'm just going to start because I've had a lot of nightmares about going over time. So, are you like a proper lesbian? I roll the word lesbian in my mouth, and it feels strange there, sort of fleshly, salivating, fresh off the boat from Lesbia, and totally inappropriate. She responds, I'd say armchair straight, armchair gay, active loner. The circus isn't in my life, it's in my head. This is an exchange between Kari, who is the protagonist of Amrita Patil's graphic novel, and her friend Lazarus. It was also the queerest sentence I had come across in a book. It embodied that moment in representation for me that everyone who has been underrepresented in art and culture yearns for. That's me, I pointed to the page with full conviction. But I knew my truth lay in Kari's cryptic answer. Coming out is a narrative, and often a retroactive one. If I were to build this narrative for myself, I'd say I came out through Kari. Kari is a contemporary story about friendship, love and death with a queer protagonist navigating a magic realism version of Mumbai. But what is queer about Kari in particular? Is it that she is in love with Ruth, who's a woman? Is it that she is androgynous? That there are panels where she's shown reading Janet Winterson, if you look closely, which I did? These are perhaps signifiers of a queerness, a somewhat shared global but class-specific marker of LGBT identities. But queer is more than that. One of my favorite definitions of queer, which is also one of the simplest ones I know, comes from Bell Hooks, and I quote, "Queer is a self which is at odds with everything around it." I find this definition evocative, a great catalyst to thinking about queer as a political project, as an aesthetic, and a way of life. It goes beyond an approach that sees queer as anti-normative, but the phrase "at odds" brings out a kind of tension, an active tension against norms that govern our bodies, desires, and everyday existence. Tensions are affective and generative. They produce multiple truths that exist simultaneously, creating fissures in surfaces in the familiar map of the everyday. They provide textured ways of living, and it is somewhere within these textures that queerness comes into being. In this paper, I argue that the graphic narrative is a form that provides the template or space for such queer tensions, textures, and complexities to be represented, especially in the context of India. There are several definitions of what a graphic narrative is, and some of these contain important technical differences, but I wish to use Hilary Schute's definition, where she defines them as a hybrid word and form image in which two narrative tracks, one verbal and one visual, register temporality spatially. This is a bit verbose, but I'll expand. These multiple definitions of the form of a graphic novel is itself interesting to note, for like queer, it acts as a shifting signifier, as resistance towards definition, falling somewhere out of the canon. The graphic novel has managed to represent trauma, history, identity, and politics in a way where the reader is made to look at multiple perspectives and the event represented simultaneously. Since graphic narratives are extensions of comics, but not quite comics, they fall somewhere between high and low culture. Now, India has been a complicated nation of several transitions throughout history. The current political project of consolidating a singular monolithic form of nationalism and identity is not just politically problematic but incredibly flawed. With a history of colonial violence and its aftermath, to represent a fixed notion of Indianness is an impossible task and perhaps even an uninteresting one. Graphic narratives therefore provide an apt medium to represent this textured reality and is the medium that India needs to address contemporary concerns and provide a politically edged critique. In terms of queer politics, because of Section 377, that is the criminalization of homosexual acts, fantastic colonial residue, queers in India still fall outside boundaries of the normal, the legal, and the legible. Queer intimacies are often performed in covert modes and spaces, leaving people vulnerable and precarious. As invisible subjects, the need to be represented is crucial. And the power of representation does not just lie in providing an image to real lives and subjectivities, but also in the production and validation of those lives. I am represented, therefore I exist. In the past few years, Gacy, an online queer space, has come out with at least 5 graphic zines that explore what it means to be Desi or South Asian and queer. Amrita Patil's Kari is the other well-known queer graphic text. But apart from these, works such as Delhi Calm by Vishwajyoti Ghosh, Corridors by Sarnath Banerjee, and various others explore, through the graphic medium, issues of capital, gender, labor, and cultural identity. These literary engagements are necessary, and the form of graphic narratives provides a wide scope to represent such subjectivities with complexity. I am in no way an expert on graphic narratives, but I am interested in the active political project of queering. I think what I attempt to do is to weave queer aesthetics and the formal elements of graphic narratives while providing examples from India with a special focus on Kari. The aesthetics of graphic narratives allow for multiple forms of engagement and disrupt linear conventions of temporality and spatiality. The act of reading a graphic narrative changes notions of space into an active process of becoming, that is spacing versus space as some fixed, static thing by itself. Thinking through space as a performance also encourages us to think of space as a kind of encounter. Since several comics rely on a non-sequential form of narrative, they are able to provide multiple modalities of viewing through spacing. Through the chaos in spacing, as readers, we are made to encounter space relationally and therefore meaning relationally too. For instance, visuals often done from a top-down perspective may do so to represent authority, objectivity, or power, but can simultaneously include subjective viewing too. For example, in this image, which is Pink by Priya Korean, the literal top-down perspective in mapping the topography of the city also allows for a personal perspective to develop. In another example, this image from Kari, sorry about the bad quality pictures, I had to get them from India. In another example, this image from Kari with the mood of urban decay and metaphors of fluidity is a visual representation of navigating through one's sexuality in a non-linear, non-sequential way. Each border that separates is a different mindscape and a different stage in this process. The various panels can be read as thoughts within Kari's mind as she faces the river or can illustrate the process of navigation itself. This image is also interesting for other reasons. Kari's friend Angel, who is dying of cancer, calls her a boatman, for she draws in people that are about to kick the bucket. She asks Kari, "Why didn't you choose to play with the pretty boys instead?" Which is basically code for heteronormativity. But Kari chooses to stay in that fluid space. She begins to understand the nature of water itself and, as an extension, how to navigate through it fearlessly. Kari is the boatman, the in-between, the non-binary, and in the midst of this role, she comes home to her queerness. As Pramod Nair states, the genre demands that we take in the images and text simultaneously and arrange them in a meaningful sequence. This provides room for a diverse range of bodies and experiences to be represented. Gender in the graphic form has the potentiality has the potential to be visually and textually deconstructed for linearity is no longer a prerequisite, and therefore meaning isn't in the same way either. A really interesting example of spatialization and perspective is in this image from Kari as she's having a panic attack. The further the image zooms out, the more you see her alienation and suffocation. This technique is a political one. It raises questions about our ways of seeing and on our experience of empathy, and is a provocative representation of vulnerability. As mentioned earlier, queer identities in India work in ways that are both visible and invisible. Due to the potential of violence, queer intimacy is often covert or silent and performs itself in a brief glance, a gentle brush of hand, or more directly as a stare that stayed too long. Gacy Zine has managed to represent these moments in a beautiful manner. Such panels in Kari too are charged with intimacy and sexual tension, often because of the large visual focus on her gaze. This consistent, unwavering queer gaze very quickly becomes our own. And this is how Kari also manages to queer the reader. This image is a fantastic visual illustration of a queer encounter in public. In the second image, the lines are queered themselves as they make love. The panel reads, "Whatever love laws have to be broken, the first few seconds suffice. After that, everything is a matter of time and incident." The graphic form is thus able to control the boundaries of invisibility in fairly complex ways. In the analysis of This Side, That Side, an anthology of graphic texts on the partition of India and Pakistan, Pramod Nair suggests and connects the term invisible history and visual ellipses to explicate the off-center representation of trauma, displacement, and marginality. Violence is one of the most difficult concepts to represent in any form, and the graphic novel provides a visual space where trauma and violence can be imagined because of the literal representation of the border. The border is the violence, and the representation of trauma lies in what is left over from the border, that is the excess. Queers also fall outside the imagination of the nation, and these bodies mark queer bodies, colonial violence, fragments of history, and a life on the margins. Perhaps the most incredible aspect of the graphic narrative is that it provides a visual representation of marginality, a space often that queer lives inhabit. Okay. Queer is also often associated with a space of in-betweenness, or as Anna Marie Jagosi puts it, a zone of possibilities always inflected by a sense of potentiality it cannot quite articulate. So I'm going to come to the concept of the gutter, which is one of my favorite concepts. And the gutter in the graphic narrative refers to the space between two images. This space allows a transition from the visual to the cognitive. Scott McCloud, who's a really well-known visual artist, calls it closure. And I find this ironic because it is exactly that space which opens up meaning. This in-between queer space allows for self-subjectivity, trauma, memory, confusion, and disruption, and is very apt to represent post-colonial narratives. Kari in this image, as you can see, uses the gutter both literally and metaphorically as she comes out of the sewage. The emergence can be read as a sign of coming out, but perhaps more precisely of coming into oneself, whatever this broken, complicated self may be. In This Side, That Side, the gutter becomes a space of homelessness, of migration, colonialism, memory. In Delhi Calm, a graphic novel that explores India post-emergency, the gutter is the emergency. The gutter in graphic narratives can therefore be re-signified as a queer space that illustrates negotiations, dialogue, and self-discovery. There are several other formal conventions, and I won't get into them. But when the form is itself fluid and deconstructive, the space for exploring queer narratives and identities is ample. Queering the aesthetics of form is as important a project as queering narratives themselves. I hope this paper is a productive intervention that allows us to think about the politics of representation in more textured ways. Perhaps, like Kari did for me, we come out in the excesses of borders and margins, or wedged somewhere between panels. Perhaps we want graphic art to help us imagine what these intimacies look like. And perhaps this is how we all find ourselves, through fiction. Thank you.
So we've had four very interesting and different papers, but I think there's a lot of commonality in terms of themes of questions of form and questions of visibility and issues of the public and the private. But I won't use my chair's privilege to ask questions, and I will open it to the floor.
That was an excellent, I mean, I'm willing to go and buy the book right now. So thank you so much for introducing someone. I was thinking about the negotiations that Aubrey Menon makes with his own identity in terms of India, in terms of race and sexuality, and I was constantly thinking about the now often talked about the figure of the queer diaspora, and the ways in which we've started thinking about it and trying to create a conceptual field to work within. Do you think Aubrey Menon gives us the resources to perhaps make it more clearer to what the queer diaspora is doing, and in what negotiations because I'm a student of politics, my question from literature is always, what is it that we can perhaps mobilize? So I just it's mostly to think through. Yeah, that's it.
I mean, it's a good and interesting question. I'm not certain I have a very good answer to it. I mean, he gives us resources to... It's on. Does it need to be closer? What? Oh, sorry. Okay. He gives us some resources for kind of trying to pursue this project, I suppose. I'm not... I mean... It's... I think it's particularly as someone who feels completely detached from all kinds of duty or morality or society, and in fact sort of tries to interrogate in fact what it means as someone who is gay or queer, who is Anglo-Indo-Irish or whatever else, to be a citizen anywhere. In fact, I think that's really and he's quite explicit about that. He doesn't, trying to negotiate what he owes the state, what he owes society, and where would that be. So I mean, he actually spends most of his life, once he sort of makes money off his novels, living in Italy, a place where obviously he is not, he's not Italian, right? I mean, so and he sort of calls it a space halfway between England and India, which I'm not sure of the math of that, but the geography of that. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to be that could be done in that direction there, and that's not a very satisfactory answer, I know,
no,
but it's
definitely the opening up of the funds.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, because Italy had been such an important place for queer British expatriates, and there was a very large community of them over the
and I think
late 19th century onwards.
And then a particular affection for young Italian boys. So I mean, I don't know, it's
shared by many of those expatriates.
Well, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I don't think I need it. Thank you. I take the time.
Yeah, I can.
Thank you so much for the paper. I thoroughly enjoyed. One comment which might not take you anywhere, but one of the pictures that you had on reminded me of Andy Wyatt's American painter, Picture Christine as well.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other, I really would like just to hear you talk more about where you see the intersections between aesthetics, queer aesthetics, and politics.
Okay. And with the Andrew Wyatt, that's absolutely the inspiration for that image. She's very inspired by Andrew Wyatt and Frida Kahlo, which you see throughout her work. But as far as intersections between aesthetics, queer aesthetics and politics, I mean, I don't see them as mutually exclusive terms in any way. I think partly the reason why aesthetics move me so much is because they're political, so this idea that somehow aesthetics is there to which politics can be applied is, in my opinion, a false one. So I think that there is potential for resistance. I've always thought that art, culture, literature speaks to political institutions sometimes in more nuanced ways than other spaces. So, yeah.
Danny.
So actually my question is sort of broad, and I was hoping that all the panelists would respond to it. So yesterday in the keynote panel, we were talking about decolonizing queer theory, and it's a very interesting point came up. Actually, Nikita Dhawan brought it up, who was dialing in from Innsbruck, and she talked about thinking of or remembering that there is no such pure political category, and often, or that there is no hallowed sort of political space to occupy, which queer kind of tries to do at some points of time. So I was wondering if all of you could sort of respond to the way in which sometimes queer can get instrumentalized in a way by the text or by the reading of the text for a particular political agenda, and whether that political agenda is necessarily neutral or is targeted, or what is the target to it, sort of in the way in which queer is being utilized. And I know you cite bell hooks, but in talking about Taiwan, you talked about how there's a very different interpretation of queer, which as Kavar means something else. It means cool boy or something like that. So or cool person. So that kind of a sort of instrumentalization of queer is kind of something that I was thinking hopefully you would all kind of respond to.
Okay. I guess I'll start. Wow, I feel like there were 2-3 things there. As far as techniques of reading decolonization and how queer is utilized, I honestly think queer sometimes can be utilized in very dangerous ways, precisely because at some superficial level it comes across as like, oh, it has no definition and it's fluid and it's applicable everywhere. But queer politics is far more rooted and grounded, and I think that that's really where the mobilization and how you do it matters. Regarding the decolonization project, in fact, I've thought about this a lot, about whether queer is really the term I want to use in India. Usual questions about, Western epistemology, it comes from there, it doesn't fully encapsulate so many experiences. But I think my utilizing queer and kind of rethinking what it means in an Indian context, in a post-colonial context, is part of the decolonization. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I believe that concepts are useful, but I think it's clear from my presentation too that I think that naming behaviors or patterns of desire or whatever kind of performatively creates a sort of essence that I think in the end works to sustain the binary homo-hetero division, and that's why I'm trying to experiment with this affective reading to look at how affects affect the way we see the world and how that makes us. It's sort of stay in the surface of the character and not try to unveil any inner truth in them that could be categorized as an identity. And as for what you said of queer as being cool, it's funny because queer actually means cool kid, and that's a whole different issue, but I do think that it has become a brand in Taiwan at least, and you can find underwear and magazines and films being sold under this label, and I personally don't think that they are what I understand by queer, but they are definitely being sold under that name, and that starts a discourse that is the one that is being enacted in Taiwan now.
Well, for me, in my research, I think about what the contemporary queer female subject in Korea, like what does she look at to see herself kind of reflected in, like what type of contents and text does she consume to see herself? And you know, she could look at or listen to like music or literary texts that have been produced by self-identified lesbians, but in Korea. But then again, there are so few of them, and the ones that do exist are often very political and mostly avant-garde. But then what would she turn to? Maybe she could watch an episode of The L Word with subtitles, you know. But then again, what I see happening right now is they return again and again to these images of what I call schoolgirl femininity and homoeroticism that I was looking at in my presentation, and it's just these types of, for instance, like they would, I guess, create fan fiction / fictions of K-pop girl groups, like things like that. So these types of meaning making occur in what you might think is the most normative of forms of texts. It's I find Munoz's concept of disidentification to be very useful in looking at these types of phenomena. So going back to your question, I don't believe in the real world nobody would actually, there is no such thing as a pure, unpolluted political text or position. It's always in relation to a world that's, I don't know, like already contaminated and already compromised, but people have the ability to create meaning out of that, and that's what we should be looking at as critics, is sort of where I stand.
Yeah, I really have very little to add to what's already been said there, except that I think it is important to recognise our own subject positions and our own agency, and be explicit about it, rather than sort of hiding behind a sort of veil of unattainable objectivity. You know, it's an illusion. When it comes to working with the likes of Menen and his texts, my subject position is very clear. This queer can be instrumentalized, and I hope it's going to piss people off. And and that's that. You know, that's all I have to add, really.
Other questions? Well, perhaps one thing I could add to bring us all together in terms of the discussion, the individual answers everyone gave to Danny's provocations, is about the transnational circulation of queerness, which both allows for the kinds of identification on an individual cultural level, but also enables a different kind of politics to take place around this term, and certainly around the academic study of queer texts. I don't know if anyone has any comments they want to make on that. Because, for example, Shamini, when you talk about decolonization and the problematics of queer, and that the other aspect of this is the way in which queer is it may have a Western epistemology, but it also has a transnational consensus around it to a certain degree, or at least a transnational circulation that might also be important, especially given the situation of large diasporic communities from basically all of the cultures that we've been talking about over the past few days.
I don't know, transnational circulation is tied to globalization, which is tied to certain neo-colonial projects, so I feel like it ends up being in that same circle. But I think the reason why I still find queer productive, and to be very honest, it doesn't matter to me so much that it has a Western epistemology, is because there is no going back to the pre-colonial, and that's a different nationalist project, you know. So it is like what the post-colonial can do with queer, what decolonization can do with queer. is perhaps say that it is enough and it's not enough, and I will use it the way I want to, and I'll use it and I'll constantly point out the fact that there is a Western epistemology and challenge it. I think that's where the potential for agency lies, or resistance lies.
Can I add something? So in the context that I study, which is Taiwan, I think it's a very difficult debate because Taiwan has been theorized as a translated culture already. So yeah, perhaps it's better to acknowledge the fact that the people talking about queer theory in Taiwan have been educated in the UK or the States. But it is true also that every time they go back and they translate the theory, translation entails a sort of betrayal to the original, and to some extent there's nothing more queer than this betrayal to the origin. So yeah.
Well, when I look at transnational aspects of like cultural dissemination in my research, I try to when we say transnational, I think we often think of it as culture moving from the metropole to the colonies, from like a top-down sort of dynamic. But nowadays, I see I don't know, texts like Sailor Moon would travel to the U.S. and become a queer icon. You know, things like that. Like, what's going on there? It's just to sort of expand our idea of transnational circulations of culture is something that I'm trying to stay aware of. And for instance, the way Korean K-pop groups are being consumed within Asia, and the sort of like cultural dynamics that didn't exist before. So there are all kinds of new movements of texts that are going on right now that I think have to be more explored. And yeah, I guess I'm sort of thinking towards that.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a really sort of critical question for what we're trying to look at in the context of both this panel and the conference. I think what I find most sort of or find most compelling about the discussions we were having yesterday, and then sort of important for this issue, is to always bear in mind the class aspect of it as well. So I think, Shamini, you were saying, you know, it's just the globalizing aspect, there's the neocolonial, not neoliberal aspects of transnational circulations, but there's also always that class aspect, a moneyed aspect, where it's being taken in by a certain class, and it's being elaborated upon by a certain class. So I think as long as we're always bearing in mind, in the same way that there's something to be said about always paying attention to that in terms of the consumption of globalized cultures as well. So whether it's, what is flowing, yes, okay, we see these texts moving between countries and cultures in very interesting ways, and we're tempted to draw conclusions about that, but I think we also have to consider who's receiving them, who's reading them, who are the consumers of these these global cultures, this world literature, or whatever we might want to call it. I mean, it's a complex question. I don't think there's a straightforward answer, but I think also always thinking about, well, liberal metropolitan elites, right? I mean, I know we're not in favour these days, but yeah, I don't know if that's much of an answer at all, or in any way helpful, but there we go.
I think we have time for maybe one final question, if anyone has one.
I just wanted to just comment and respond to what you were kind of saying already. So just in terms of what you were saying, Shamini, like this whole way in which queer kind of operates, I mean, in so many different contexts, I found very interesting when Neville Hood, who's a South African scholar on queer theory, says, that it's the best set of tools. It's not enough, but it's the best set of tools we have at the moment. But it's very interesting how people play with that, which I really like in all the papers. There's just so many different readings of all of it. But there's this constant sense of caution. So coming back to the way in which you were using affect and talking about it, because sometimes I feel like, even though it's the best set of tools, it's so easy to co-opt. The scariest examples are in Taiwan, where it's always, Taiwan is always hailed as, since 2001, it's been hailed as the the country on the cusp of legalizing gay marriage, gay rights, all of those things. But and under that, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on. Like you have arrests like the ones in Indonesia of gay men in bars and stuff like that, and that sort of disappears. Have this discourse that this is always avant-garde, this is always queer, is always politically progressive. We tend to forget the scary things that are going on.
Yeah. I just wanted to respond to that by saying I think it's really interesting you bring up Neville Hoad in this context, because while he may have said it's the best set of tools, he also explained a kind of larger politics of development and colonization that happens. And I think it's interesting for those two ideas to speak to each other and say it may be the best set of tools, but it's also on a certain geopolitical scale in which places like the global south or like generally the non-west will always be seen as less progressive, less developed. So I think we negotiate with queer, and that's perhaps the best we can do, because at the end of the day a word like queer, because of its kind of expansive, elastic meaning, there is still something liberating about it. I would be I would be the last person to say that it isn't.
Can I also add maybe that I think that it's always important to draw a distinction between the kind of the politics of queer and liberalization and liberation and all the emancipatory potential that it has, and not associate that with the actions of states more often than not. Yeah. I was going to sort of talk a little about another mixed race Irish Indian who has been in the news recently, and that is the incoming Taoiseach or Prime Minister in Ireland, a guy called Leo Varadkar. And the global press, the British press, the American press, everywhere, it's like Ireland elects its first gay brown Prime Minister, woohoo! And the Irish press is like, this guy's Thatcher, and he sleeps with boys, like that's it. So can you please stop getting excited about how progressive and
politics at its best.
Right? I mean, but the global press is just looking, going, oh, Ireland's getting it. They're getting their act together. They decriminalised. They did this, they did that. Gay marriage, blah blah blah. Now we've got a gay, and they're like, no, please stop.
Yeah.
There's nothing liberating about this. There's nothing emancipatory about this. So,
except for the fact that someone from that background could inhabit Thatcherite views.
and that's a whole separate conversation.
That's scarier.
Yeah.
Well, I would like us all to thank the panelists.
Thank you everyone for coming to this panel. We're now having a lunch break until 1 o'clock. You'll be able to find food stands outside the front entrance and also the shop in the common room, which is to your left as you walk to the front door. So we'll reconvene here or in the DLT at 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think there's